Good afternoon and welcome to our first event of the 2020 Wrap-Up series. I'm Steve Wright, Workplace Consultant and Chair of the CoreNet UK Workplace Community. We'll be bringing you 3 events as part of this series, which will consider the learning and updates from this unprecedented year for all of us. I don't think we could have ever predicted the ways in which we would have had our work and personal lives disrupted by COVID-19. Our New Year event in January, Predictions and Resolutions, would have needed a crystal ball and some very accurate psychics to foresee just how our year ahead would actually turn out. Our next event is tomorrow, the 19th of November. Please tune in at 1 p.m. Please do book if you haven't done so already. And next week we have another on Thursday the 26th, all of which promise to bring insight and thought leadership on the way ahead as we approach 2021. We had planned to bring all these to you from the sofa in a live broadcast setting, but sadly we've been forced to revert to a virtual format because of the second wave of lockdown restrictions which came into force a couple of weeks ago. Let's hope we are on track to have the full lockdown lifted on December the 3rd, and we do get some semblance of normality going into December and certainly for Christmas. We hope that you're not suffering from too much Zoom, Teams or webinar jam fatigue, although this continues to be a new phenomenon affecting all of us as we adapt our working and meeting protocols to deal with closed offices and remote contact. Today we'll have 30 minutes or so of our formatted questions before we move on to questions from you out there in the audience. Please do use the chat function to pose the questions for our panelists, and we'll use the last 15 minutes or so for some lively discussion and views. And there'll be a short wrap up with some reminders and a couple of slides just to tell you what's coming up next. So on to today's topic. What do we mean by what if? An intriguing title perhaps. We've all heard a lot about the new normal. Whether you like the term or not, and predictions on what the office-scape may become. In the early days of the pandemic, we heard, mainly via LinkedIn, that firstly, the office was dead. We also heard that organisations would no longer need premises. We heard that hub and spoke is the way forward, and we also have times of crisis. But we've all witnessed societal change in 2020. A spring of summer full of caring and inclusion, sponsored walks, raising money for charity and keeping an eye on our neighbours. We've moved on to split views on the pandemic and the infringement of our individual freedoms and social liberties. We've seen changes to our work patterns and team structures. Redundancy and furlough have become all too familiar amongst colleagues, friends and family. But rather than guess at what the office may look like, what if we consider how work itself may change? Today, we'll consider the requirements of occupier organisations, some future initiatives, and how corporate restructuring could alter the world of work as we know it today. By accepting that we already have the seeds of change, how can we predict what the office of tomorrow may look like without a broader discussion of the factors that will drive the world of work into uncharted territory? Perhaps we need to rethink the brief before we come up with a solution. And to tackle this topic, I'm joined today by Rachel Edwards, Senior Strategist on Workplace Futures at Lendlease. Rachel brings a wealth of insight into the changing nature of work and the rapid acceleration of the means by which we'll adopt these changes. Steve Hennigan, Founder and Director of the Hennigan Consulting Group. Steve continues to work with a wide range of occupiers across all sectors in developing strategies to assist in the optimization of their businesses, space and performance. And Jason Turner, Associate Principal from Perkins & Will. Jason also has a wealth of experience and knowledge in the workplace design sector and brings with him thinking that questions the very nature of work itself. So let's move on to our dialogues. We have 3 questions to pose today. And the first of those, picking up on the societal changes that we've actually seen this year, what are the most profound fundamental societal changes that you foresee happening in a post-COVID-19 world? And perhaps we'll go to Rachel with that first question. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. So my initial response, and I think it's been the response the full way through is that nobody actually knows what what the biggest societal change is going to be. My personal view is that we've been tackling these barriers to evolution for a really long time. And now we've been thrown into this big pot where it's all been mixed around and suddenly we're dealing with them all simultaneously. So with that in mind, and the fact that we are now able to accelerate past things that we were previously struggling with, this change is inevitable. The biggest hypothesis that I've seen is this blurring of boundaries between, workplace, home, general lifestyle, and I think that's something that we're going to have to start to design into place to help support it. The most interesting thing for me when looking at this is those bigger structural shifts that we'll see coming through, such as the public-private collaboration, outdoor lifestyle infrastructure that councils are putting in place, but also that occupiers are starting to build into those places. I know lots of people going through, say, Soho, have seen what cafes are doing. Is that something that is going to change the way we want to live in the future? New policies that organizations are putting in place, technology that's helping us to work differently. Are more people going to join the gig economy because now that barrier to entry is also being removed? So that's all interesting, and what that means for place is super interesting. I joined one of our sort of graduate a panel to discuss an innovation project that a bunch of our graduates have been working on yesterday. And I was absolutely astounded by what they've been able to come out with. But the biggest and most interesting thing for me in this year is that a lot of it is now fully achievable. And that's what we should be looking at. So that was pretty fantastic. Wrap up. If we've learned anything, it's that we just need to design with humans at the center of it, because we don't really know what around us will change.
All good points, and I think the blurring of boundaries and change being inevitable, probably two very profound factors in that. But certainly will be affecting the way in which we start to design and conceive workplace. Jason, perhaps you'd like to pick up.
Sure. So, as Rachel said, this is very much crystal ball gazing, but I think I am pretty confident in my response to the first question. This is what is going to take place in some shape or form along the lines we've been seeing. But from what I've picked up, that the degree of remote working has not significantly impacted employees' ability to be productive. In fact, in some respects, it's actually improved. And so this says to me that one of the outcomes from that is how people are managed, how directors, managers oversee what they do and how they add value. Because if people are sitting at home doing work and rarely talking to anyone senior, but getting on and doing what they need to do, it begs the question, what is the purpose of the sort of the management layer? And I think the shift that probably may be already happening and is related to I think across two or three of the other questions that Steve's going to bring up, but is their role should no longer be that of directing, apportioning tasks and just waiting for people to finish and checking up on them, making sure they're present. It's actually becoming more of an educational role. Having been out the office quite for long stretches myself and working in a team, the thing that you miss, apart from the social aspect of it, which is another dimension, but the ability to have those informal conversations, to answer questions, to ask someone how they're doing, etc., is much harder. And they're actually really important, particularly for sort of more junior members of the staff. And so the management role is really, I think, shifting towards that of being more supportive, more about mentoring, providing advice, assisting and supporting people, as opposed to simply directing tasks that need carrying out and monitoring that they're done. So I think that's one shift that I can see happening. And it's sort of the other side of the coin is a little bit is, lots of people have had this taste of freedom from the 5-day-a-week commute. And as Rachel mentioned, there's, the home and work distinction is blurring, working from home from work. And possibly the 9-to-5 routine will start to sort of shift as well. It becomes a lot more fluid, and it's tailored around what people are doing, where they want to be, and what they want to do. So there's going to be a lot greater variety of patterns of travel in and out of spaces and locations. So that's my sort of response and bet on that. I think the remote working piece is here to stay. It just remains to be seen in what shape and form, or forms, plural, it might work.
Yeah, interesting. And I think interestingly, you bring up a point that starts to break against some of our traditional understandings of what management is about, when maybe we're moving away from just the technical oversight or the passing on of technical knowledge to people, and that the management structures and layers do need to become a bit softer in terms of understanding and getting the best out of people, but making sure that if we are adopting different work patterns, that we start to see different responses in terms of how HR is conceived, and really what training is put into the management layer, I suppose, is another very interesting question, which probably brings me on to Steve to maybe bring a bit more of the occupier insight into this particular question.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I think what I want to summarize is really bring in what both Rachel and Jason have kind of said together, and what I think is not necessarily the biggest change, but I think is accelerating a change which was already there, which is around ownership. And I think ownership is a word which is particularly relevant in the UK. I'm of a generation where it was drilled into me from a very early age that you go to school, you go to university, and then you buy a house, and ownership had a kind of a sense of status with it. And I think if you look across Europe and you look at other parts of the world, they don't necessarily have that same fascination that I think we historically have in the UK with that sense of ownership. And I think that's already started to happen. So you look at the shared bike schemes, the Boris bikes as they were when they were introduced. You look at what technology has done with things like Spotify and Netflix. And I think people, particularly of a younger generation, are starting to move away from that kind of sense of ownership. I think what COVID has done is almost ripped it from us in two very different ways. So I think firstly, on a personal level, as a workplace consultant, it's been a joy, because we're now having a much easier time convincing people that they don't need their own desk when they eventually come back to the office. I agree there's a bit of crystal ball gaze in there. I'm not sure any of us would commit to knowing exactly when that would be at the moment. But I think secondly, and probably more fundamental from a society perspective, which really tunes into what Jason said, is about the ownership of time. So pre-COVID, despite what organizations would tell us, most people still had this 9 till 5 culture, and there was a perception that between those hours the organization owned your time. So maybe you pop out for lunch, you go to the gym, but you're effectively on company time. And I think during the COVID period, due to childcare reasons, other life issues, mental health issues, caring for elderly family members, managers have had to very reluctantly let go of that. And because of those very personal reasons, they've not been able to grab it back. And I think, as Jason said earlier, we've seen that most people can be trusted. Most people can deliver work when their time isn't owned by their manager. So I really kind of see that as the kind of, hopefully, the biggest change that we kind of see embedded, whether people are working in the office or people are working from home. That's a much broader debate, and it's going to be a different answer for different people. But hopefully that kind of sense of ownership changes, and it starts to catch up with how we've seen the word ownership being used in other areas of our personal life around technology, transportation, etc.
It's a very interesting one. And I think the whole premise of ownership and the ownership of time, if you look at, well, property and time, if you look at the French model, for example, there's an awful lot more rental which goes on certainly across the whole of continental Europe, that not necessarily purchasing your own home. And so maybe that does shift the emphasis away from the way in which we think more generally about what it is we do actually own and what it is we're selling to other people. But the cultural shifts as well, and I think societal, if we come back to the societal impact of that, if you look at quite a lot of Europe in the way that it actually works, it is quite different to the way in which we do it. We often hear these things about productivity, and the UK being low on productivity when measured individually, which is quite an interesting one because we all feel that we work bloody hard. But when you see that stacked up against the way in which, if you look at the Netherlands, for example, the team time is actually put in before the working day starts. You do get that assembly for breakfast. You do get those things, and it's not just going to the pub after work because you've finished at 5 o'clock or 5:30, or when I may be late today because I've got something that's going to take me to 6:30. So yeah, maybe it is more of a, I don't know whether or not we feel that is more of a UK centric thing, but certainly I think we could probably all agree with that ownership is a fundamental to it. I've started to see some questions coming in here. I will be picking up on these questions. Please do keep them coming in from the audience. A couple of interesting ones there already. But I'm going to move on to our second question to the team. I'm going to start with Jason this time. And this is quite an interesting one. It does come back a bit to the softer angles that you were mentioning in particular, but many organisations have already responded by creating and implementing renewed positive cultures and behaviours through their company structures. How much of what we have seen is founded in crisis management, and how will this be carried forward once we come out the back end of this crisis?
So I think something Rachel mentioned earlier, this has been a hell of a year. It's quite a watershed if you look at everything that's sort of piled one thing on top of another. What with the pandemic, which subsequently we get another amazing result in terms of vaccine development, like unheard of in terms of the speed at which that's arisen. Obviously the US election and various other populist politics, all of these things sort of swirling around. Don't forget Brexit. So I think what that's done, it's stirred everything up so much on so many different fronts that there's a lot more openness to sort of thinking differently, because so much is up in the air and with so many things are being challenged, and I think that's driving lots of different issues around inequality, race and gender issues, and certainly environmental issues all seem to be rising to the surface more and more. But so that this climate of uncertainty and change, I think, will hang around for a while. Again, difficult to say how much will stick and how much will fall away. But the one thing, going back to the point I was making earlier in the first question, I think there's going to be quite a bit more questioning of work. What work we do, what's valuable, what's productive and useful, and what is work that you just do sort of administratively. It's not particularly compelling, it's not interesting, but it's the 9 to 5 and you get it done. And particularly with sort of the younger generation, sort of the Gen Y and beyond coming into the workforce, their expectations could be quite different. They want to find something really meaningful and positive, and not just another salaried 9 to 5:30 job. So I think there will be a change in business culture, again, following on from some of the points I was trying to get across before, and less command and control, more mentoring, more motivating, and so the traditional modes of work and the actual nature of that work, I think, will start to shift. And you throw in the thing about AI and the development of machine learning, and which is being taken seriously by a lot of financial services and legal firms in terms of all of that processing work, then you're sort of taking a huge slice of what we currently know as the traditional sort of service economy. So the other point, which I think will probably stick in a slightly more light-hearted matter, I think a lot of this will bring around the death of the formal business attire. How many people on the panel have sat and done a call with someone in a suit and tie? No. So I think, and again, it kind of is going with the times, because if we're sort of starting to think about a much more flat hierarchy and structure within organisations, the suit and the tie is very much a uniform. It's something that sort of says about either status or compliance with the status quo. So whilst it might sound a bit light-hearted, I think that is indicative of people starting to feel that individuality and diversity is more important than uniform.
That's a good point, because I can guarantee I certainly haven't sat down with anyone with a tie on, certainly since probably March this year. But no,
and shops are going to be full.
Yeah, and I guarantee that all of us on this panel today have in the summer we're sitting with a shirt on the top half and a pair of flip-flops and some shorts on the bottom half, because nobody knew. I do wonder, actually. That's quite an interesting one regarding business attire and the formality of it. Rachel, what do you think is going to be we're going to be carrying forward that's come out of crisis management, and what are the essentials in that?
I agree, it's not a suit and tie. So I'm still thinking about Steve's comments before on sort of building sort of belonging, essentially, between across an organization. I think that is what we've immediately jumped to right now, to say, how can we keep everyone feeling part of the same organism? How can we continue to embed this sense of purpose? The Lend-Lease, co-founded, but also has been very involved in the Loneliness Lab over the past couple of years. And at the start of all of this, so the Loneliness Lab is an initiative which looks at how we can reduce loneliness through the design of place and space. And at the beginning of this, we thought, well, the only place that anyone is spending time is their home. So what do we need to do to continue building belonging in that situation? And we sort of uncovered there's this software where you're building this connection through policies and sort of well-being programs, etc. And then there's the hardware that starts to nudge all of that coming through. So I think that's sort of one side of it. But then the big question will be, once we've built all of that up, once we can go back into the office, what will we want to go back to? And through that, I think a lot of organizations, this goes back to Jason's point as well, a lot of organizations are actually now questioning, what's the value in what we're doing? What's going to attract people? What will make them feel as though they have that sense of belonging in our organization whenever we go back? We at Lend-Lease, we've been sort of exploring that, now using this as sort of a pause opportunity to reevaluate the purpose of place in all of that. And I mean, place has had it's never just been about sort of presenteeism, and I think now it's not about collaboration either. It's always been sort of a way to bring together kind of people and customers and products and services in one, wrapped all together in one experience. So I think a big question that a lot of people are going to have just now is, when we're finding new ways to have those experiences online, what is the value of place whenever it comes to doing that?
People, place and process. I mean, I think they're all still relevant completely to what we're talking about. And in fact, that is the office-scape, isn't it? Or the workscape, if you like. So how those things are enabled. Steve, would you like to pick up the thread on that one?
Yeah, and I think maybe I'll come back to that kind of value of place, because I have quite a strong view on that from the various occupiers we've been working with and supporting through this process. But I think, just coming back to your question, Steve, around what's founded in crisis management, I think if we think about crisis as a term, a crisis is something big. And generally when we see something big or macro happening, it brings people together. So if we start with the positives, for me, London 2012 was a fantastic example of that, where we actually talked to people on the tubes, people in the street. We were very, very different for a 2-week period, and then again during the Paralympics, and then we almost reverted back to normal. And I think the same happens in bad times. There's some great examples of that through the Great Wars, and I think also more recently we've kind of seen that through some of the movements Jason talked about, some of the things which I think have happened in the last year, and also some of the more recent terror events. And I think it's because something big, something like a crisis, brings people together because there's a common cause or a purpose, and all of our day-to-day priorities become less important when we're all focused on that. So I think COVID has kind of done that. I think in terms of what's been done in crisis management, how much is looking forward, I think we've made do, or we've made the best of it. I think we've seen most organisations rally very quickly, and I think what for me has been incredibly encouraging has the amount of leadership visibility we've seen. I think there is a slight irony that people have probably seen more of their leaders when they're not in the building with them than they are now, because there seems to be more of a conscious effort to put town halls on for a CEO or a managing director to show they're sitting at the kitchen table as well. And I think a great degree of kind of humility and transparency. However, I think what the message I've got loud and clear, and perhaps you'd expect me to say this given my job title, every organisation we've talked to, regardless of geography, in the UK, international, public sector, private sector, charitable sector, when we talk to the people, not the management, there is an overwhelming desire to get back to the office in some shape or form. And again, we'll part what that looks like or how many days a week it is. For those things that Jason talked about in the first question, it's serendipity, it's water cooler moments. And interestingly, what we've discovered when we've really kind of pushed on this with people, it's informal, unplanned meetings. And we've done a bit of brainstorming on this internally. And when you think about that as a term, for something to be unplanned, it means you were there doing something in the first place. So for me, this idea that you do your individual work at home and you kind of come into the office to collaborate is slightly flawed, because again, it's not serendipitous, and it doesn't allow learning, it doesn't allow relationship building to happen in the kind of the natural way which we all kind of knew and loved pre-COVID. So I kind of think for me, what this has hopefully taught us about going forward is that there is a real value in the office. Maybe it's a slightly different shape, maybe it's slightly smaller, but there are fundamental things about not just how we work, but how we want to live and be as human beings, which absolutely have to happen in a central office from my perspective.
Which I think takes us back into the issue about societal change and that support. And I think you make an excellent point regarding the fact that we as humans are pack animals, and we do have the need to convene. We do feel more comfortable when we are around other people. We miss that. And Rachel's point regarding the loneliness lab, it's something that I did tune into as well for the introductory sessions, and found it absolutely fascinating that you think in a world where we are actually so connected, how can we be so lonely? And living in these great metropolises that we inhabit. Very, very interesting points. But I think if there's one thing that also, Steve, you just said, there's a degree of humility, because we've probably all seen the senior leader sitting at the dining table and being Zoom bombed or Teams bombed in the background by the dog or the cat or one of the kids, because there was homeschooling going on, or not attendance and no childcare on a particular day. It has made a lot more people, I suppose, a bit more tactile and human in terms of the accessibility and our perceptions of them, that they are not, coming back to Jason's point, just somebody who wears a tie to the office because they're in charge. So I think all very, very good points which are coming out. We're getting some good questions coming through, folks, as well. So please do keep them coming. I'm going to move on to our third question before we get on to a bit of debate and picking up on some of these questions that are coming through. Steve, I'm going to come straight back to you with this one. And this is an interesting one, and probably something that you'd have seen inside the organisations that you've been working with. And it's really arranged around emphasis is, do we think that the emphasis that is currently placed around people and well-being will remain in the spotlight in future? What do we think will fall away and what will stay as essential? And I think the backdrop for that is, if we're turning back to the normal sort of profitability models of organisations, how much of this, the good stuff, will we actually keep? And maybe it does start to touch on what makes an organisation the employer of choice in a world where there is more choice for people. So, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think a slight disclaimer and apology up front. I've probably been one of the people who have been quite vocal with blasting the kind of the HR profession over the last few years at their kind of lack of participation in kind of our workplace and our agile projects. And it's up until February this year, very rare that we would engage with a HR professional inside an organisation in an ongoing way. For me, what's been really interesting is that HR have not only kind of come to the table as a result of COVID, but they've very much led the way for most organisations. And I think without exception, every organisation we're working with, our client team now consists of somebody from a real estate or a facility side, but also somebody from the HR side of the business. So I think kind of, for me, it's almost that kind of perfect storm, which we as an industry have been banging on about for as long as I've been associated with CoreNet. That how do we get IT and HR and workplace? Like COVID has kind of done that for us. I think the work that most HR teams have done has been phenomenal through this process. What I've been party to, the outreach programs, the mental health, the mental support programs, individual programs, team programs, doing things for people on a personal level, kind of going beyond that kind of corporate responsibility. And I think it's been brilliant. I think, as you said, the reality is the pendulum is probably about to swing from an economic perspective, and inevitably things are going to get tight. Unfortunately, I think it's those invisible things that I've just talked about which are usually the first things to go, because it's quite easy to remove those without fully understanding or seeing the kind of the value equation. So I think from our perspective, I think there's almost a duty of care of kind of as a CRE sector, as an industry, to almost stand alongside our HR colleagues and back them and support them at this time. They've kind of come to the table. I think bricks and mortar, it's important, but we're effectively providing the environment for all of these things to happen. And I think as we go through this process, it's important that we 100% work with our HR colleagues and we support and we put the things that they've been doing over the last 12 months as the top of the agenda for things which need to stay going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's all extremely well intentioned. And I sincerely hope that we actually do buy into that and blue chips do start to commit to those programs. Jason.
So I'm sort of pulling a slightly different angle for some of the points I made in the first question around productivity, because there is the flip side of this can be seen in the sort of levels of stress, isolation, frustration, etc., that working from home can also apply. And I have to confess, I found lockdown number 2, part 2, quite tough. Slightly in the first time round, the first couple of months was pretty good. I was really enjoying that, and then it sort of the shine wore off somewhat, and then we were allowed out again. But so this time round, and I'm sure I'm not alone, I found it quite a bit harder. Partly the time of year and the weather, possibly. But anyway, enough about me. But I think what this sort of comes back to is that the ability to talk about emotions and feelings within the workplace, and to Steve's point about how HR need to be engaging with a lot of this, and are indeed. I mean, certainly at our workplace, it's regularly brought up as an issue that we need to focus on. But I think the taboo of expressing your emotional state is perhaps going to lift more. I mean, again, sort of, this is a little bit of a prediction, a little bit of hope that this is the direction that things may take, in terms of just being sort of kinder with everyone in the workplace, being more prepared to be open about how you're feeling, or how other people are feeling. And the benefit of this, I think, is that this is something that Perkins and Will have been exploring in one or two of our offices in the States, around neurodiversity and the benefits of having people with different outlooks, different perspectives, different views. And these are not intellectual things, these are sort of emotional things. They express themselves in one way or the other. And that brings with it the ability to, I think, could bring the ability to make problem solving more effective. Different perspectives, different views, broadening out the sort of subjects that sort of aren't set for a sort of a typical middle class white male like me. So I think from a sort of, again, going back to considering the future of work being something that is more collaborative, perhaps more complex, but more valuable, means that you need wide ranges of people to achieve that. Now, going back to bricks and mortar that Steve mentioned, the quality of the environment still has a big part to play in this, I think, because if you think about an environment that has extremely good quality of light, the temperature, the ventilation, the cleanliness, the sort of the physical aspects of the place that you do some of your work in, that's going to contribute to people's sense of comfort and sort of connection to the organisation. And I think just to the final point was that, as you were saying, Steve, and the other points that were raised around the fact that regular face-to-face social contact is very, very important to mental health, as you mentioned, Steve. And ultimately, that's the social glue which defines your company's culture.
Yeah.
You know, if you can't connect to each other, you're never going to connect to some sort of blanket corporate statement. And you know, if that's not the case, and the people are the culture, then the brand will fade, and employees' purpose and motivation and connection to the brand will diminish.
And I think that's brand. You've mentioned a great word there, brand. And I think that a renewed emphasis on 2 points that you've made. One is EQ coming up to match IQ, and actually the acceptance of that through organisations is probably the most important of them. But let's hope that we do actually start to recognise what are the essentials. And Rachel, what is your view on that particular question? What do we think will fall away, and what will stay as our new essentials?
I think it comes back to that idea that, you know, your work and your organization it's an organism made up of people. It's not a place. It's not anything else. And everything that enables that group of people needs to be designed around what they're trying to achieve collectively. Right now, we are in, as Steve put it, we've come together really strong because we've been in this crisis. Well-being's been front of mind. But as we do start to go back to business as usual, that's when the really hard work kicks in. I think well-being and people and culture will be so important from becoming that employee of choice comment that you mentioned before. We certainly have had HR or people and culture at the forefront of deciding our way forward. They're leading it with, you know, what is our value statement? What are we trying to achieve? How do we build purpose? How do we build a mission? And then what do we need to put around us to be able to achieve that? Which we are sort of exploring quite heavily just now. We're a super sort of nimble organisation anyway, because we work across all of the UK. We've got 4 different sites just now in London that I remember pre-COVID, seems like a very long time ago, being in maybe all 3 on one day. So I think we had an interesting starting point, but if you now look at it with home being involved and potentially a much wider ecosystem of places, how do we really build that community glue that brings everyone together? I think on top of that, when it comes to bricks and mortar, the questions we need to ask are more around, as you put it, Jason, how do we What does brand mean to us? How do we differentiate our brand? And how would we do that if we were only online? How do we attract people to want to come to our organization and stay if we don't give them a different experience? So a lot of that needs to be built in. How do we compete? How do we attract customers? And so essentially it will come back to each individual organization. But I have a strong feeling that the office isn't going anywhere. It's just going to evolve
in terms of what it is. And I think, again, the B word, brand, came up there. It's something that's fascinated me throughout my career, which is a term that I've given is brand manners. And brand manners is really the dialogue that exists, in my view, between the organisation and the employees. You buy into that in the same way that you judge whether soap actually cleans your clothes quite well or not. What does that brand stand for? And is that a factor which will start to point us towards the occupiers the employers of choice in who we go to work for in the future? Very interesting point. We've got some interesting points being made actually coming in. Not all questions at the moment. Please do keep the questions coming in. We're going to move on to that quite shortly. First, a point from Christina, coming back to the European issue we were talking about earlier. I can confirm that the European focus experienced in France and Germany is much less about buying property early on, but more about your career and what one can achieve. I would say that this is a UK-American thing to buy property early and get on the ladder. It's way more common to rent property for the majority of your life or throughout your life and only buy when one settles for good, but keep this property for many decades. So I think a reinforcement there. Good to see that one. A point in from David. Sorry, just lost that one there. My organisation has brought HR and workplace together with wellness to create a colleague experience function. Again, underpinning there. We got thumbs up on that one, David. It's really good to see these kind of things. And I'm going to move on to a question which actually does take us back into the provision of the actual workspace itself. And this is a question from Mark. So the question is, does co-working space come out from this well, or is it the demise of co-working space? Who wants to come in on that one?
I could start. So right now, a co-working space that is on our development in Stratford has been inundated with requests. And I'm guessing in this situation, it's because a lot of people are being forced to work from home. But I'm going back to this idea of being sort of more human and providing flexibility. I can see it picking up as part of the ecosystem. So people won't just have this sort of a big HQ and then provide home on the end. It needs to have a diversity in between that allows people to have that choice of where they work best, how they can perform high. So I think co-working spaces have a big opportunity right now to develop and diversify.
Anyone else have a contrary view to that? Or are we seeing that more as a sort of hub model?
I wouldn't say a contrary view, but an expansion of that view. So I'm not surprised that Rachel's or Lend-Lease's experience of that co-working space has been inundated. But what also interesting is that co-working as an industry is starting to diversify itself, because at the one end you've got the WeWork, which is the kind of the WeWork is the brand in this instance. That's what you're buying. You're buying a WeWork product, and then you go through to the sort of what organizations like Fora and so on that position themselves as more sort of blue chips, the sort of the better quality, the acoustics work, for example. And then you get something like British Land's Story offer, which is a kind of, it's like buying a suit off the peg. You can sort of change the material. The cut is always going to be the cut, but the material, sort of the sizing, all the rest of it is going to be standardized, which is a bit this sort of hybrid model of office, if you like, white label office space. That you can sort of put a bit of your kind of individual culture or organizational culture into temporarily. So it's sort of becoming a sort of a blend of options within co-working. I don't know if you guys, Steve or Rachel, agree, seen some of that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It sort of becomes the club in between your sort of your hub or your HQ and your home. What's that ecosystem that you can sort of brand? And then, you know, I go to the one near my house and I see my coworkers who also live near me. And there's also an interesting thing in there where it's this phenomenon where if you identify people who live near you, you're more likely to become friends with them because you can hang out on weekends, and you know you've chosen to live in the same type of neighborhood with the same experience. Another interesting point on that is if more people do decide to work from home, how do they build another community, or another workplace community that's maybe outside of their organization? And will that lead to more innovation because you're sort of connecting more with different types of industries?
Interesting point.
So, Steve, if I can add to that, I certainly don't think it's the death of co-working, and I think if you look at the two polar end examples of people who use co-working spaces, there's the small startups, and I think we're going to be certainly seeing more of those. Redundancy is a great catalyst for people starting up themselves, and you see a lot of new and great businesses come out of a financial downturn, and actually those individuals and small teams are using those co-working spaces to get and feel all of the things which all three of us have talked about through this, that they're not big enough as an organization themselves to have it, but they can get that from being part of a bigger collective. I think if you look at the more enterprise end of co-working space, again, we're starting to see organizations kind of look at downsizing, or the kind of the hub and spoke model, where I think we may see a difference in the future is the location of those spaces. So we talk with our clients quite carefully about remote working, not home working. So it's the opportunity to work somewhere outside of your hub location. If, for example, I live out in Essex, if I work for an organisation who say I can't come into the office, or I shouldn't be in the office on a few days a week, I would be much more likely to use a co-working space if it was within 15 or 20 minute drive or walk from my house than I would come into central London to use one. So I think we're going to start to see a very different network appear across the UK of where those spaces are.
And it's interesting. We had a question come in on this actually from Steve, expanding on Steve Hennigan's views at the start regarding time and ownership of the desk. Does he see that extended to companies taking more of a pop-up, short-term, or of occupancy of real estate space, and therefore more of a theatre or prop reaction to workplace design? I think that probably does start to take us into the point that Jason's made, and it's a bit more vanilla space. And another term that we've heard for it is Cat A+. Is that actually going to be putting more of an emphasis onto the offering that's coming out from the funds and the landlords themselves, as opposed to the operators, which I think does take us down a slightly different path? I'm going to come back to another point here, another question actually, and this is about a little theme I think, Rachel, you just started to touch on, which is this kind of organisational, new cultures emerging, if you like, and it's a question from Gillian. Do we think that we will start to see subcultures appearing more within organisations? Maybe this is just themselves as opposed to the new high street friends that you're developing. We're hearing about traders that have been running together to exchange information during lockdown. Do we think that there's more of a subculture possibility that will start to emerge from this, and organisations within organisations reteaming the teams?
I think that happens to a degree already. I can think there's in our office there's a yoga club, and so certain people go, on a Wednesday evening go and do a yoga class. There is a regular lunchtime running club which has a slightly different mix of people in it. Then there's people who go to the pub. But, I mean, whether you term them as subcultures is perhaps not quite the right description, but I guess it depends also on the size of the organisation, where you're not so sort of mixed together. You're a little bit more detached from sort of the bigger organisation.
Interesting. Steve?
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think having been in some of those larger organisations myself, I can completely relate to what Jason's saying, and I can think from a kind of a personal level that there would be a group of people who would go to the pub on a Wednesday night or a Thursday night. So I think maybe COVID has forced people to think about different and perhaps slightly more innovative ways of doing that. But I think whether virtually or kind of face to face, those things are always there, and I think always will be.
Yeah, I suppose like the cycling culture, people tend to band together around their own interest, don't they, really? I'm going to make another point, and then I'm going to move on to another question. I'm conscious of time, and I'm also conscious of giving our audience the 5 minutes courtesy time at the end of this session to actually get themselves organised before their next 2 o'clock Zoom, Teams or whatever they're joining this afternoon. It's a point from Christina, and she says, there's definitely a more human factor in play now in our industry, which I'm hoping is here to stay in the new normal. Some companies were pretty ahead on flexibility, agile and remote working, educating and mentoring management style. This crisis has given others the opportunity to catch up and reconsider, maybe reconsider their own structure and approaches. And it takes me into the last question I'm going to pose to the three of you. So whoever would like to come in first on this one. But it's more of a personal question. What couple of current organisational attributes or activities do the panel personally hope will continue post-COVID? Hands up.
I'll go first. I mean, it's an obvious one, and I've kind of already said it. But I do in the interim between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2, the ability to go into the to pick up my phone. We've got an app on there. You book yourself into the office and check in when you arrive, and then you check out when you go, and so sort of this switching on and off of being at home, being in the office, totally at my discretion, because I want to go into the office for a change of scenery, because I want to have a chat with a few team members, or staying at home just because I want to get my head down, or I've got somebody coming around to fix something. That flexibility is great, and I don't want to lose it. And I think that's a very common experience for most people, I guess. So it's rather an obvious one, but that first and foremost makes quite a big difference in terms of work-life balance and having the mix of home and work that's under your control, which comes back to Steve's point about ownership. Sort of having ownership of your time. Yeah,
Steve.
Again, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I think it's things we've talked about already. I come back to Jason's point earlier around openness and transparency, and I think Christina kind of mentioned it there in her comment. I think there seems to be a level of transparency and openness that people have had. Maybe it's confidence when you're talking to someone through a screen and not face to face, but I've had lots of conversations with people who have admitted their problems and challenges. I've done the same, like Jason. I've had ups and downs through the process, as I'm sure we all have, and it's felt like it's okay to talk about that, and I really hope that doesn't go away as we all come back face to face. And I think the other thing which I'm hoping will stay is just an openness to change. This is for all of us, I'm sure, been the biggest single event in our working life, and it proved pretty quickly that all of those things we didn't think could happen can happen, and they do happen just fine. So when we come to the next issue, whether it's a pandemic or a financial one or whatever it will be, because these things don't tend to sort of have too much time between them, that collectively as an industry we can kind of go into it with perhaps that open-mindedness and kind of be a bit more open to new and different ways of doing things in advance of that, rather than waiting and responding to the event.
And Rachel, final word from you.
Cool. Mine are actually quite similar to those two. The first one that came to mind is this idea of feeling you belong to an organization. And what we started doing quite early is having sort of an all-staff broadcast on what's going on. And I've learned so much in lockdown about things going on across my organization that I feel a sense of belonging more now than ever, really, because I feel I can talk about those things. And I can reach out to people that maybe I'd never met. So I'm making new relationships in that way that I hope will continue whenever things go back to a sort of business as usual. And then the second thing was just being able to explore, being open to explore sort of new ways of doing things. I feel like right now a lot of people are finding ways to meet, going for walks in the park, hosting sort of meetings in different ways or with different people. And I hope we keep that, because that's how we'll know what really works and what keeps life exciting.
And probably a nice note actually to end on there in terms of us really human factors that you've mentioned and the things that make us smile at the end of the day. Well, thank you. Thank you to Rachel, Steve and Jason, and to all of you for tuning in today. This session is a springboard to enable us to continue the debate in 2021. And we hope to bring you an extension of this topic early in the new year. We'd like to widen the topic out, not to include just the knowledge workers in our society, but also teams across multiple sectors where the workplace may not be just an office setting. We'll be trying to include HR insights and technology expertise in the discussions as the pace of change continues to accelerate into new and exciting futures for all of us. But I think that maybe the message we've seen today is that if we don't reframe the brief, we won't get the appropriate delivery of the new workplace model. So it's important that we are as inclusive as we can be in terms of that dialogue. And just for a few wrap-up messages, in terms of upcoming events, please do book for the 3rd of February, where we will have Christina Stigliano speaking with Alison Rankin of Schroders. We have also the further 2 events in our wrap-up series, which is tomorrow, 1 p.m, Occupier Insight, a look back to move forward. Again, hopefully we're picking up on some very, very interesting points there. And next week, in fact, on the 25th, I said to say the 26th earlier, sorry, the 25th, is wrap-up, part 3, Place, Tech and Talent, a New Dynamic. January 2021 will be flexible working, how to thrive and not just survive. Should be another fascinating topic. And 2021, predictions and resolutions. If it's anything like this year, well, get your crystal balls out, folks, because that's going to be one to follow on with. Another little reminder just for everyone, if you haven't yet done so, please do go and do your membership renewal. We rely on our members, and as you can appreciate, this year has been a bit tough. We haven't been able to have events, but please do make the most of the networking opportunities and the learning that we continue to bring you through CoreNet. We hope it's going to be as fascinating next year as it has been this year. A big thank you to our sponsors who have generously supported us through this difficult time this year, and they are IWG, IBM, Savills and TP Bennett. And as a final word of thanks, thank you again to our speakers today, Rachel Edwards, Steve Hennigan and Jason Turner. I hope that everyone has enjoyed the event. You have about 2 minutes left for your comfort break and to grab a coffee before your 2 o'clock session. And please do tune in again tomorrow. Thank you everyone for watching.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.